The version of events Kody Brown keeps pushing is starting to fall apart. And not because of angry fans, not because of online rumors, and not because of clever editing. It's falling apart because too many people from too many different places are now telling the same story. And when that happens, the problem isn't perception anymore. It's credibility. Stay with me, because once you hear how this pattern formed and who noticed it first, you won't look at Kody Brown the same way again. For years, Kody has insisted that he's misunderstood, that the breakdown of his family was the result of disloyal wives, bad communication, and outside pressures he couldn't control. Every interview, every confessional, every defensive outburst has carried the same underlying message: this wasn't my fault. And for a long time, that explanation worked, at least for some people. But lately, something has changed. The cracks in that narrative are no longer subtle. They're widening, and they're being noticed by people who have absolutely no reason to protect or attack him. What makes this moment different is not just what's being said, it's who is saying it. These aren't longtime sister wives critics with years of built-up frustration. These aren't ex-wives rehashing old wounds. These are outsiders. People who didn't walk in with opinions, didn't know the backstory, and didn't care about the history. They simply watched Kody Brown operate in real time, under pressure, in unfamiliar environments, and walked away with the same unsettling conclusion. And here's where things get uncomfortable for Kody. When strangers, working independently of one another, begin describing the same behaviors using the same language, it stops sounding like bias and starts sounding like observation. No coordination, no shared agenda, just repeated experiences that don't line up with the image Kody keeps trying to sell. This is the moment where his carefully curated version of events begins to unravel. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, piece by piece, as each new account adds weight to a growing contradiction. Because the more Kody explains himself, the more people start asking a dangerous question. If this keeps happening everywhere he goes, what's the common denominator? In this video, we're going to walk through exactly how that realization took shape. We'll look at the moments that raised eyebrows, the situations where Kody's behavior spoke louder than his words, and the subtle turning points where people stopped giving him the benefit of a doubt. This isn't about piling on. It's about understanding why the story Kody tells no longer matches the reality others are experiencing. And trust me, you're going to want to stay until the end, because once all these pieces are put together, it becomes painfully clear why so many people are quietly backing away from Kody Brown's narrative. By the time we're done, the question won't be whether his version of events is falling apart. It'll be whether it was ever holding together in the first place. What's striking about the way Kody Brown's version of events is unraveling is how quickly outsiders picked up on the same issues that longtime viewers had been pointing out for years. These weren't people primed to dislike him. They didn't arrive with context, history, or expectations. In many cases, they didn't even know his name beyond being another participant in the room. And yet, almost immediately, something felt off. When people encounter Kody without the buffer of family loyalty or years of emotional investment, they aren't listening for explanations. They're watching behavior. How someone responds to stress. How they treat others when there's nothing to gain. How they act when they aren't the center of attention. And this is where Kody's narrative starts to run into trouble, because behavior has a way of cutting through rehearsed talking points. Several people have described the same initial reaction: confusion. Not outrage, not anger, confusion. They couldn't quite place what they were seeing at first. Kody didn't come across as openly hostile or aggressive right away. Instead, there was a sense that he wasn't fully registering the people around him. Conversations felt one-sided. Interactions felt transactional. There was an odd disconnect between what was happening and how Kody seemed to be processing it. And that confusion slowly gave way to realization. As situations became more demanding and teamwork became essential, patterns started emerging. Kody wasn't adjusting. He wasn't reading the room. He wasn't responding to cues that others instinctively picked up on. Instead, he stayed locked into his own internal script, focused on how things affected him, how he appeared, and how the moment fit into his personal storyline. This is where the outsider perspective becomes especially revealing. Without years of built-in justifications, people didn't rush to explain his behavior away. They didn't frame it as stress, editing, or misunderstanding. They simply noted what they experienced and moved on. And when those experiences began to line up across different people, in different settings, it raised an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe the problem wasn't the environment. Maybe it was the approach. What's important here is that no one needed to sit down and compare notes for this pattern to become obvious. It showed itself naturally, in moments where cooperation mattered, in moments where empathy was required, in moments where leadership meant slowing down rather than pushing ahead. Over and over again, Kody seemed to miss those moments entirely. This is the point where his long-standing defense, that he's been unfairly portrayed or misunderstood, starts losing its power. Because misunderstanding requires confusion on the part of the observer. What we're seeing instead is clarity. People are seeing exactly what's happening, and they're reacting accordingly. And once that clarity sets in, something subtle but significant changes. People stop trying to decode him. They stop asking why he's acting a certain way. They stop offering grace. Instead, they begin adjusting their expectations, not because they're angry, but because they're no longer surprised. That shift is quiet, but it's devastating. Because when people stop being surprised by problematic behavior, it means they've started to expect it. And that's when a narrative truly begins to fall apart. In the next part, we're going to look at the specific situations where Kody's behavior mattered most, the moments where pressure stripped away the explanations and left only reactions behind. And once you hear how those moments played out, it becomes clear why so many people reach the same conclusion without ever comparing notes. Pressure has a way of revealing what explanations try to hide. When everything is calm, it's easy to appear reasonable, cooperative, even misunderstood. But when the stakes rise and the environment stops accommodating you, behavior becomes impossible to mask. And this is where the gap between Kody Brown's words and his actions became impossible to ignore. In high-pressure situations, most people instinctively shift their focus outward. They scan the room. They adjust. They check in with the people around them because survival, emotional or physical, depends on awareness. What multiple observers noticed about Kody is that he didn't make that shift. As conditions became more intense, he didn't become more attuned to others. He became more inward. Instead of responding to what was happening in front of him, Kody appeared preoccupied with how he was being perceived. His energy wasn't directed toward solving the collective problem. It was directed toward maintaining momentum, staying ahead, and reinforcing the image he wanted to project. And while that might look like confidence on the surface, under pressure it quickly turns into something else entirely. This is where his long-standing explanation that he's a natural leader begins to unravel. Leadership isn't about moving first or speaking the loudest. It's about situational awareness. It's about knowing when to push and when to pause. What people experienced instead was a man who treated shared challenges like solo tests, moving forward without checking whether anyone was still with him. The most telling detail isn't that mistakes were made. Everyone makes mistakes under stress. It's that the same type of mistake kept happening. Kody would press forward, assume others could keep up, and only realize something was wrong after the damage had already been done. And even then, acknowledgement was minimal. There was no recalibration, no visible self-correction, just a continuation of the same approach. Observers didn't describe this as malicious. They described it as absent, a kind of tunnel vision where other people stopped registering as separate individuals with limits, needs, or struggles. And that absence is far more troubling than anger, because anger can be addressed. Absence suggests something deeper, a disconnect that explanations can't easily repair. What makes this especially damaging to Kody's narrative is that these moments weren't exaggerated or dramatized after the fact. They were experienced in real time. People felt the consequences of his decisions immediately, whether that meant being left behind, struggling without support, or having to step in and compensate for what wasn't being provided. And when that happens repeatedly, the story Kody tells about himself starts to feel irrelevant. Because no matter how often someone insists they're misunderstood, the people around them can only respond to what they experience. And what they experienced was a pattern of self-focus that didn't adjust when circumstances demanded it. By this point, the benefit of the doubt was already thinning. People weren't angry yet. They were alert, watching more closely, waiting to see if Kody would recognize the impact of his behavior and change course. And that brings us to the next turning point, the moment when it became clear that adjustment wasn't coming. There's a critical moment in any group dynamic when people stop waiting for someone to lead and start quietly taking over. It doesn't happen loudly. There's no announcement. It happens when confidence in one person's judgment erodes just enough that others realize they can't afford to rely on it anymore. And this is where Kody Brown's version of events starts to visibly crack. As situations grew more demanding, people around Kody didn't confront him head-on. They adapted. They began compensating for what wasn't happening. Someone else would check in with the group. Someone else would slow the pace. Someone else would take responsibility for keeping things together. Not because they wanted authority, but because the alternative was letting things fall apart. This is devastating for the narrative Kody keeps pushing. He presents himself as a strong, decisive leader who is unfairly undermined or resisted. But what witnesses describe looks very different. What they saw wasn't rebellion. It was necessity. Leadership didn't get taken from Kody out of spite. It drifted away from him because people needed stability, not speed. The shift was subtle at first. Small decisions made by others. Quick adjustments. Quiet check-ins that didn't involve him. But over time, it became obvious that Kody was no longer the reference point. People stopped looking to him for cues. And when that happens, leadership is already gone, whether it's been officially acknowledged or not. What's especially telling is that Kody didn't seem to notice this shift happening in real time. He continued operating as though he was still in control, still directing the flow, still setting the tone. Meanwhile, the people around him had already recalibrated. They weren't following his lead anymore. They were working around it. This creates a dangerous disconnect. When someone believes they're leading but no one is actually following, every move they make becomes more disruptive. Decisions feel abrupt. Pace feels reckless. Direction feels disconnected from reality. And the more Kody pushed forward, the more obvious it became that others were actively trying to manage the fallout of his choices. This is the point where Kody's insistence that he was sabotaged starts to lose credibility. Because sabotage implies intent. What's being described here is response. People reacting to what was happening in front of them, not plotting against him behind his back. They weren't trying to make him look bad. They were trying to get through the situation intact. And once people step in like that, something irreversible happens. Trust doesn't just weaken, it resets. From that moment on, everything Kody does is viewed through a different lens. Not as leadership, but as risk. Not as confidence, but as lack of awareness. In the next part, we're going to look at the emotional impact this had on the people around him and why those reactions matter more than any explanation Kody has offered since. When people are confused, they hesitate. When they're frustrated, they complain. But when they feel genuinely affected by someone's behavior, their reactions change in a very specific way. They become more careful with their words, more deliberate, more honest. And that's exactly what started happening around Kody Brown. What stands out in these accounts isn't dramatic outrage or exaggerated storytelling. It's the tone. People describe their experiences with a kind of disbelief, as if they're still trying to process what they witnessed. There's a hesitation, not because they're unsure, but because they didn't expect to feel the way they did. Emotional responses like that don't come from isolated misunderstandings. They come from repeated moments where someone realizes they can't rely on another person the way they assumed they could. Several people described feeling responsible for situations they didn't create. They found themselves stepping in emotionally, reassuring others, slowing things down, or taking on burdens that weren't technically theirs. Not because they wanted credit and not because they were trying to correct Kody, but because someone had to do it. That kind of emotional labor leaves an impression, especially when it's unacknowledged. And here's where Kody's narrative takes another hit. In his version of events, he's the one carrying the weight. The misunderstood leader, stretched thin, unfairly blamed. But the emotional reality others describe tells a different story. They felt unsupported, overlooked, in some cases, actively dismissed. And that disconnect between intention and impact is impossible to ignore once it's been felt firsthand. What makes this especially damaging is that these emotional reactions didn't fade with time. People didn't look back and soften their descriptions. If anything, their clarity increased. As they talked through what happened, they began connecting dots they hadn't seen in the moment. Small incidents that felt strange at the time suddenly made sense when viewed as part of a larger pattern. There's a particular kind of realization that happens when someone understands they were compensating for another person's absence without even realizing it. It's not anger, it's recognition. And once that recognition sets in, it changes how every prior interaction is remembered. Moments that once felt confusing suddenly feel obvious in hindsight. This is where Kody's insistence that he was unfairly treated starts to ring hollow. Because emotional reactions don't come from editing or bias. They come from lived experience. You can debate facts. You can argue interpretation. But you can't talk someone out of how they felt when they were standing in the middle of it. By this stage, the story people are telling about Kody isn't emotional, it's reflective. They're not venting, they're explaining. And that difference matters, because explanations carry weight. They suggest understanding, not impulse. And understanding is exactly what undermines Kody's defense. In the next part, we're going to examine how these experiences line up perfectly with what longtime Sister Wives viewers have been saying for years, and why that overlap is impossible to dismiss anymore. This is the point where everything starts to line up in a way that's impossible to ignore. Because once outsiders began describing their experiences with Kody Brown, longtime Sister Wives viewers felt a strange sense of recognition. Not shock, not surprise. Recognition. The details were different, the setting had changed, but the behavior sounded painfully familiar. For years, viewers watched Kody explain conflicts away using the same framework. He was disrespected. He wasn't supported. He was reacting to disloyalty. Each situation was framed as a one-off, a misunderstanding here, a breakdown there. But taken individually, those moments were easy to rationalize. Taken together, they told a much bigger story. And now, that same story was being told by people who had never seen an episode of Sister Wives in their lives. That overlap is what makes this moment so powerful. When strangers describe the same patterns fans have been pointing out for over a decade, it strips away the argument that editing or long-term resentment is responsible. These new observers weren't influenced by Christine's frustration, Janelle's distance, or Meri's heartbreak. They didn't walk in with opinions about Robyn or expectations about family dynamics. They simply interacted with Kody and walked away with the same conclusions. Viewers recognized the themes immediately. The way Kody prioritizes his own perspective above all else. The way he moves forward assuming others will adapt to him, rather than adjusting himself. The way accountability is always reframed as attack. These weren't new revelations for fans, they were confirmations. What's especially striking is how often viewers pointed out that the behavior outsiders experienced mirrored what Kody's family had described for years. The emotional absence, the lack of follow-through, the tendency to interpret resistance as betrayal. Suddenly, the family's complaints no longer sounded subjective. They sounded descriptive. This is where Kody's long-standing defense truly begins to collapse. Because if his wives, his children, and now complete strangers are all describing the same experience from completely different angles, the explanation that everyone else is wrong becomes unsustainable. At some point, coincidence stops being a reasonable answer. And it's not just viewers noticing this alignment. Kody himself seems increasingly defensive when confronted with it. The more the narrative tightens, the harder he pushes back, insisting he's being misrepresented, insisting people don't understand him, insisting context is missing. But the problem with repeated patterns is that context stops mattering. Patterns create their own meaning. By now, the question isn't whether Kody is misunderstood. It's why he keeps reacting the same way across entirely different environments. And that brings us to one of the most revealing parts of the story. What happens when Kody's explanations are put side by side with observable outcomes? At this stage, Kody Brown's problem isn't that people disagree with him. It's that his explanations no longer align with what keeps happening around him. He can describe his intentions in detail, he can explain his mindset, he can justify his reactions, but none of that changes the outcome. And when outcomes repeat, explanations lose their power. Kody has consistently framed himself as someone reacting to difficult circumstances. According to him, he's pushed because others resist him. He's firm because others are disloyal. He's distant because others pull away. But when the same dynamic unfolds in entirely new environments, with entirely new people, that logic starts to collapse. Because the circumstances changed, yet the results didn't. This is where many people reached a quiet but decisive conclusion. If the same conflicts follow someone from family life to public life to high-pressure group settings, then the issue isn't situational. It's behavioral. And no amount of reframing can override that realization once it sets in. What makes this particularly damaging is that Kody's explanations often focus on intent, while the people around him focus on impact. He talks about what he meant to do. They talk about what actually happened. And in every comparison, impact wins. Because people don't experience intent, they experience behavior. There's also a noticeable absence in Kody's storytelling: adjustment. When most people realize their approach isn't working, they adapt. They change tone. They ask questions. They recalibrate. What observers noticed instead was repetition. The same defenses, the same framing, the same refusal to acknowledge how his actions landed with others. And repetition is dangerous because it invites comparison. Once people start comparing notes, even unintentionally, inconsistencies stand out. The more Kody insisted he was being unfairly treated, the more others remembered moments where fairness wasn't the issue. Awareness was. By this point, his narrative wasn't being challenged aggressively. It was being quietly set aside. People stopped engaging with it. They didn't argue. They didn't debate. They simply moved forward without factoring his explanations into their understanding of events. And that's far more damaging than criticism. Because when people stop arguing with your story, it means they've stopped believing it matters. This is the moment where the fall becomes unavoidable. Not loud, not dramatic, just inevitable. And in the final part, we're going to bring everything together: the patterns, the reactions, the consequences, and explain why this shift feels permanent, not temporary. When you step back and look at everything together, it becomes clear why the version of events Kody Brown keeps pushing is no longer holding up. This didn't unravel because of one interview, one argument, or one bad moment. It unraveled because the same outcome kept repeating in different places, with different people, under completely different circumstances. And at a certain point, repetition becomes confirmation. Kody wanted to be seen as a strong leader who was unfairly blamed for situations beyond his control. Instead, what people experienced was someone who struggled to adjust, struggled to read the room, and struggled to recognize how his behavior affected those around him. The more pressure increased, the clearer that disconnect became. And once people saw it, they couldn't unsee it. What makes this moment so final is that the observations didn't come from one source. They came from family members, longtime viewers, and complete outsiders who had no emotional investment in Kody's story. They didn't coordinate. They didn't compare notes. They simply described what they lived through, and those descriptions lined up in ways that are impossible to dismiss. This is why the narrative feels different now. It's not being actively attacked. It's being quietly replaced. People aren't debating whether Kody is misunderstood anymore. They're recognizing patterns and moving on with that understanding. And once a narrative loses relevance, no amount of repetition can bring it back. The hardest truth in all of this is that Kody keeps insisting he's being misrepresented, while refusing to acknowledge the one thing that could actually change the outcome: accountability. Not explanation. Not justification. Accountability. Without it, every new situation produces the same result, and every attempt to defend himself only adds another layer to the contradiction. So the real question now isn't whether Kody Brown's version of events is falling apart. It's whether he even realizes it already has. Because when people stop arguing with your story and start adjusting their expectations instead, the shift is permanent. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Kody understands how differently people are seeing him now? Or do you think he's still operating inside the same version of reality he's been defending for years? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. If this breakdown helped you see the situation more clearly, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next, because the next chapter in this story is already unfolding, and you won't want to miss it.